There is a thing I did not yet understand on the morning I set the first stone in place. A cool gray September morning in the foothills above Carpenter Creek, with the larches already turning gold at the ridgeline, and Bram lying flat in the dry grass watching me from 10 yards off as though he was deciding whether the work merited his attention. I did not understand that the hillside Ned Vass had left me, the 40-odd acres of broken rock and thin soil that no one in the county had ever bothered to want, was not the punishment it had been handed to me as. I understood only that I was cold in a way I had not expected to be cold in early autumn, and that cold was the one thing my father had spent his life teaching me to read. The month was September of 1887. The place was Harlan County, Montana Territory, a crease of foothill country that sat between the high grazing flats and the Ponderosa timber, where the winters came down from the Canadian ranges the way a door shuts, all at once and without discussion. My name was Nora Voss. I was 34 years old. My husband Clarence had been 2 years in the ground, taken by a fast fever in the June of '85, and what the fever did not take, Clarence's brother Ned finished off with paperwork and a lawyer from Billings who charged more per hour than a working ranch hand earned in a week. The homestead title, the cattle, the barn, and the root house, and the good bottom ground along the creek, all of it went to Ned by terms of a deed Clarence had signed in a worse year and apparently forgotten. What Ned left me was the rocky quarter on the hill, because no one had ever found a use for it, and because leaving me something with a deed attached was the easier side of whatever arrangement his conscience required. Clem Burge told me what I had when he drove past on the wagon road that first morning and saw me dragging fieldstone up from the creek bed. Clem ran the general store in Carpenter, the kind of man who kept a mental ledger of every acre in the county and who its rightful owners were, and he had strong feelings about both. He pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at me standing shin-deep in the creek with a flat stone the size of a washboard cradled in both arms. And then he looked at the hillside behind me, and then he looked back at me, and he said nothing for a long moment. "What exactly is it you're building, Nora?" he finally said. Not a question exactly. More the voice a man uses when he has already formed an opinion and is waiting for confirmation. I told him I was building a shelter, a stone room low against the hill, something that would hold heat in winter. He sat with that a moment. "Stone don't hold heat," he said. "Stone holds cold. Everyone knows that." He clicked his tongue at the horses and drove on. And that was the beginning of what people in Carpenter began calling Nora's Stone Folly before the first October frost had settled. What I knew, and what Clem Burge did not, was that my father Henrik had been stacking dry-laid stone since before I was born. He had come from a coastal valley in Norway in 1871, a place where the rock was limestone and the winters were long, and the men who built well were the men whose families survived. He had come to Montana with nothing in the way of money, as most of them did in those years, but he had brought the understanding of stone the way another man might bring a profession or a family name, carried in the hands rather than in a valise. He built 3 homesteads in his working life in Montana Territory, each one tighter and warmer than the last, and when he died in the winter of '82, he left me no money and no title, because he had none to leave. What he left was the knowledge of how stone behaves when it is laid correctly, and a worn leather notebook of sketches that I had kept wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of my dry box since the day we buried him on the south-facing slope of his own hillside, which was warm enough in winter that the ground stayed loose below the frost line. His grave was the first proof I had ever needed that he knew what he was doing. I want to stay with my father for a moment, because he is the reason any of this is worth telling. If you have found yourself in this story, the kind of story where a woman is handed the worst piece of ground in the county and told to make something of it, then stay with me. Because what happened that January is the kind of thing a person waits a whole life to understand. My father's name was Heinrich Grahl, and he had learned to read stone in a place where reading it correctly was a matter of the family living or the family not living through the season. He was a lean man with large, pale hands, and he moved slowly the way careful men do, stopping often to look at what he had just set in place, turning a stone over in his hands before laying it the way another man might turn over a question before answering it. He did not talk much except when he was working, and when he was working he talked constantly, in a low voice addressed to the stone more than to me, explaining what he saw in each face in each angle, and what it required of the course below it. I had followed him since I was old enough to carry a stone that was not too heavy, and I had understood perhaps a quarter of it at the time. But the understanding had grown in me in the years since the way understanding sometimes does, slowly, through the body, rather than the mind, arriving one morning when you pick up a stone, and your hands already know where to put it before your thoughts have caught up. Heinrich Grahl had a way of explaining stone that I never heard from any other man. He would say that wood is a good liar, that it looks solid and feels solid, and it burns well and it holds a nail, but that wood is always working against you in a wall, swelling and shrinking, letting the cold find its seams. Stone, he said, is an honest partner. It doesn't pretend. It tells you exactly what it knows, and what it knows is the temperature of the earth below the frost line, which in most of Montana territory runs from 38 to 42 degrees all winter, warm as a root cellar, warm as a held breath. If you build with stone and you build close to the hillside, and you give the stone enough mass, enough layers, enough depth, it doesn't hold cold as the men on the porch will tell you. It holds the earth's own warmth, the slow, deep warmth that no blizzard has ever reached, and it releases it gradually across weeks and months, the way a river releases the heat of summer into autumn. The fire in such a structure is not the only source of warmth. It is the companion to a warmth that has been building since the hillside first grew light in August, banked into 60 tons of dry-laid rock like money in a careful man's account. I remembered one lesson in particular. I had been perhaps 12 years old, and we were building the third homestead, and my father had stopped me from laying a stone I had chosen, and asked me instead to carry it back to the creek and select another from the flat water-smooth faces near the bank. I asked him what was wrong with the first stone, and he said nothing was wrong with it, that it was a fine stone and a strong one, but that it had a slight convex face on its top side, and that when a stone's top face curves upward, it sheds heat the way a roof sheds rain, that the warmth you build up inside the mass slides off a curved face and is lost. A flat face holds what comes to it, he said. The cold cannot carry away what the stone will not give up. He handed me a flat-faced limestone the weight of a small Bible and set it in the course himself to show me the angle. And then he made me lay the next 6 stones in sequence and correct myself twice. And by the time the day was done, I understood the principle not as instruction, but as knowledge. The kind of knowledge that rides in the muscles of the forearms and the particular tension in the wrist when a stone is seated true. I had my father's notebook. I had the hillside, which was all broken granite and schist, stone that lay in natural flat plains the way good masonry stone will, as though the hill had been waiting for someone to read it. I had Bram, who was 3 years old that autumn, and had decided some months earlier that I was his entire concern in the world. And I had Silas, my sister May's boy, who was 10 that year, and had come to live with me after May and her husband Deacon died of the same fever that took Clarence, within 2 weeks of each other in the June of '87. Silas was small for his age, and very quiet in the way that children are quiet, when they have seen too much and are deciding what to make of it. And he followed me up the hill each morning with a tin cup of coffee for me and a piece of cold cornbread for himself. And he did not ask me why I was building what I was building, which was the most useful thing anyone did for me that whole autumn. By the end of September, I had the foundation course laid, 8 feet into the hillside at the back wall, 2 feet below grade, a trench I had cut with a pickaxe and a pry bar through 2 weeks of mornings while Bram watched from the dry grass, and Silas carried stone. The work was slow and it was heavy, and there were mornings when I looked at the trench and could not see it ever becoming anything but a trench. But I had my father's sketches, page after page of his careful hand, rendering the courses in cross-section, the angles marked in his cramped Norwegian notation, the back walls lean drawn with a small arrow indicating how the weight should run. And I held the image of each sketch in my mind as I worked the way a woman holds the image of a finished garment when she is still cutting the cloth. The community in Carpenter had noticed. Ruth Hadley, who kept a farm 2 miles south and who was the only person in the county who had ever treated Clarence's land dispute with Ned as the injustice it was, came by on a Wednesday to see what I was doing. She walked the perimeter of the foundation trench and said nothing for several minutes. And then she said it looked like something from the old country. I told her it was. She said she hoped it would be warm. She said Harlan County winters were getting meaner, that her father had said the same thing before, the bad winter of '73, and that she had a feeling in her knees about the coming one. I told her my father had said that the worst winters always gave a sign in the autumn, that the ground hardened too fast and the birds left too early, and that this autumn both of those things were true. She looked at the ridgeline, which was already bare of any bird larger than a sparrow, and she went home without saying anything else, and I did not see her again until January. October came and went, and I worked every day that the ground was dry, often from first light until the light failed, Silas beside me or fetching water from the creek, Bram restless at the perimeter until the late afternoon, when he would settle at the base of the front wall as though he had decided his shift was done. The back wall went up 3 courses, then 4, the stones fitted dry without mortar in the way my father had taught me, each stone set with a slight backward lean into the hill so that the weight ran down and inward rather than outward, so that the mass of the hillside itself became part of the structure. The front wall I built in the same way, 4 feet high, with a low doorway I framed with 2 long lintels each weighing close to 200 pounds, stones that Silas and I moved on a sledge over 3 mornings, and that my father would have recognized as the kind of lintel that might still be in place a century from now if the courses beneath them were laid right. Inside the room I laid a floor of flat stone over a 6-inch bed of dry gravel for drainage, and in the back corner I built the hearth as my father had taught me. Not a fireplace in the common way, but a low stone box, open at the top, with a flue channel running horizontally through 6 feet of the back wall before it turned upward and exited through the sod roof, so that the smoke traveled 6 feet of heated stone before it went to air and left that heat behind in the wall. A straight chimney takes the heat with it, he had always said. Give the heat somewhere to stay before it goes. Once, when Silas asked me why the smoke went sideways before it went up, I tried to explain it the way my father had explained it to me, the feeling first and the reason second, the way he had always taught it. I told him that stone is slow, that it takes warmth a long time to travel through stone, and that this is exactly the point, that slowness is not a flaw, but a gift. Because while the warmth is traveling through the back wall, it is staying there. And while it is staying there, the people on the other side of the wall are warm. I said that the men in town who said stone holds cold are not wrong about a single stone on a cold day, But they are wrong about 60 tons of stone that has been sitting in a hill since before any of us were born, that has been holding the temperature of the deep earth in it all winter and all summer, and all the winters and summers before. And that has never in all those years dropped below 38 degrees a foot below the surface, no matter what the air above it was doing. Silas thought about this for a long moment and then said, "It was like how a big river takes a long time to freeze, even when the shallow parts go hard." And I told him that was exactly right, that he had said it better than I had. And I could tell from the way he looked at the wall after that the knowledge had gone in the right way, through the feeling of it before the words. By the time Clem Burge drove past again in mid-October, the walls were chest high and the roof timbers were in place. He stopped the wagon the same way he had stopped it in September, and he looked at what I had built, and his face did something complicated that he resolved into a slow shake of the head. He said it to Walt Ennis at the store that afternoon, which was how it traveled back to me. "Nora Voss has built herself a root hole in the hillside. A man could not stand up straight in it. She's gone and piled that whole rocky hill into a room the size of a privy, and she calls it a shelter." The phrase that stuck was not root hole. What stuck was what Clem said on the porch of the store 2 weeks later, when my neighbor Harley Cook asked him what I was doing up there on the hillside each morning. Clem said, "She is stacking Nora's folly, one stone at a time, and she will be stacking it all winter, and it will keep her no warmer than a stone keeps anything, which is cold." Harley Cook repeated it because Harley Cook repeated everything. And by early November, when I chinked the roof boards with sod and laid the last course of the front gable, the name Nora's Folly had become the name of the thing, the way a derisive name will become a place name in a county where people keep accounts of one another's mistakes. I did not say much in response to any of it. There was no use. Clem Burge had been right about which way the summer's cattle market would run for 3 years in a row. And a man who has been right 3 times in a row is not a man who is listening for the 4th time to go the other way. What I understood, and what he did not, was that the question was not going to be settled by argument. The question was going to be settled by the winter, and the winter was already on its way. November brought the first hard frosts, and they came earlier than anyone in the county remembered, the ground ringing under a boot heel in the first week of the month, 2 weeks ahead of a normal year. The creek froze along the banks in the second week of November. The cattle on the North Flats were restless in the cold, the way they are restless before a hard winter, bunching and moving in the wrong directions. And the men who ran them said the same thing they always said, which was that it would ease, and that the good grass had been good all summer, and that the year would end well. Bram moved inside the stone room at night without being invited, which he had never done with any shelter before, and I took it as the same testimony my father would have taken it as, which was the honest opinion of an animal that had no stake in being correct, and every interest in being warm. Silas slept on the pallet near the hearth and said the rock walls were strange and quiet, in a way the old house had never been. I told him strange and quiet was the point. I had 6 months of cordwood stacked along the east exterior wall by the middle of November. 3 full cords, more than the stone room should have needed if the walls did their work. But I had learned from my father that the margin between surviving and not surviving a bad winter was always built in the preparation, never improvised in the middle of it. I had dried provisions enough for 4 people, for 4 months. Salt pork and dried beans and cornmeal and turnips in the gravel floor root pit I had cut below the hearthstone, where the temperature stayed above freezing even when everything outside was locked in ice. The jar shelf along the back wall held everything I had put up since August. 41 jars of preserved vegetables and fruit and pickled meat. It wasn't wealth. It was the kind of readiness that looks, from the outside, like excess. And excess is one of the things a county of people living close to the edge will always hold against a woman who has been publicly labeled as improvident. Clem said it one more time, the third time, at the autumn church social the first Sunday of November, when the question of winter preparedness had become the general subject of the room, the way it always did that time of year. He said it when my name came up in the context of the hillside structure, and he said it with the particular mild confidence of a man who is not yet wrong about anything that matters. That stone folly of Nora Weiss's will be cold enough to hang beef in by February. He said it in front of August Pell, who was the county surveyor and who had a habit of writing things down, which turned out to be a detail that mattered later. The first heavy snow came on the 14th of December, 1887, and it did not stop for 3 days. By the time it stopped, there were 2 feet on the flat, which was not unusual for Harlan County, but the temperature that followed the snow was unusual, dropping on the 17th to minus 22 degrees, which was the kind of cold that split fence rails and killed cattle where they stood, if they were not already in shelter. The grass ranchers north of Carpenter had not built much shelter because the summer had been good, and the cattle market had been strong, and a man who has been right 3 years in a row does not build for the 4th time to go wrong. By Christmas, the cattle losses in the county were already being counted in the dozens. The plank houses along the creek road were burning their furniture by the 1st of January. Mrs. Walt Ennis told me later that she and Walt had burned everything that would take a nail, the chairs and the chest frame, and finally the kitchen table. And still the water in the bucket froze before morning. The Harley cookhouse had lost 2 panes of glass to the cold, the glass simply cracking across as though the cold had reached through the wall and laid a hand on it, and the wind came through the gaps the way a voice comes through a wall, thin and constant and without mercy. January of 1888 arrived as though it had been waiting. On the 3rd of January, a second storm came down from the Canadian ranges, and it made the December snow look like a rehearsal. The temperature on the 4th was minus 38. On the 6th, it fell to minus 42, and the men who had instruments to measure it measured it only once, because the instruments froze when they tried to bring them back inside. The snow was not falling so much as moving sideways, a continuous white wall that made the distance between a house and a barn a dangerous journey by compass. The creek road disappeared under drifts the height of a standing man. By the 9th of January, the snow in the low draws stood 9 feet deep, and the plank houses along the road were losing their heat so fast that the families inside could see their breath at the fireside. The losses mounted in a way that felt less like counting and more like arithmetic being done to you by something that did not notice your name. The Protter family lost their entire herd of 40 head in 4 days. The Strand family to the north lost every animal they owned, except a mule that had somehow pushed through into the timber. The family on the Ennis South Quarter, a young couple not 2 years settled, lost their child to cold before anyone could reach them, a loss that settled over the county like a different kind of storm, one that left no snowpack and no accounting. By the 15th of January, the cattle dead in the county numbered in the hundreds, and the men at the trading post in town were saying the figure would reach the thousands before February, which it did. 800 head confirmed dead by the end of the month, 60% of the county's grazing stock stiffening in the draws and the coolies in attitudes of waiting. Harley Cook brought his wife and their 3 children to my door on the morning of the 7th, a walk of 4 miles through waist-high drifts that had taken them the better part of 2 hours. His wife, Agnes, was carrying the youngest. Harley's face was the particular white-gray of a man who has made a decision under fear and has not yet decided whether it was the right one. He stood in the low doorway of the stone room, and the warmth rolled out past him into the cold, and he stepped inside without saying anything, and his wife said, "God above," very quietly, and sat down on the floor near the hearth with the baby held to her chest. Ruth Hadley came the next morning with her 2 grown daughters and a sack of dried corn. The Prodder family came on the 9th, the Nels Strand family on the 10th. By the 12th of January, there were 14 people in the stone room, sleeping in shifts on the 2 pallets and the spare quilts I had folded into the corner of the root pit. And the temperature inside the room, measured by the small brass thermometer my father had owned and that I had carried in my coat pocket all autumn as a kind of habit of his I had never shaken, held at 51 degrees. Outside, the thermometer that August Pell had mounted on the north face of the county recorder's building was reading -31. Bram slept near the door with his head on his paws, calm as a stone himself, and Silas sat against the east wall and told the younger children the names of things my father had taught me to say in Norwegian, which was the only language that seemed right for a room built the way that room was built. The cordwood lasted, the food lasted, stretched by what the others had carried with them. On the 14th of January, when the temperature outside fell to its recorded lowest, the temperature inside held at 48 degrees, with the fire banked low for the night. A fire you could have cupped in both hands, because the 60 tons of stone in those walls had been absorbing warmth since October, and were releasing it the way my father had always said they would, slowly, steadily, the way the earth below the frost line has always been warm, the way the truth about something takes a long time to reach the surface, but does not lose any of its temperature on the way up. It was Clem Burge who came to the door on the 17th of January. He had come 4 miles in drifts past his waist, alone, because his wife had taken sick with a deep chest cold 3 days into the storm, and he had burned through his cordwood trying to keep her warm in the plank house, and the plank house was losing the argument. He had walked the 4 miles himself, which wasn't a small thing for a man of 61. And when he came around the last turn in the hill path and saw the stone room sitting low against the slope with the smoke rising thin and steady from the flue pipe, he stopped walking for a moment as though he needed to look at it before he knocked. He stood in the doorway the same way Harley Cook had stood in it, and the warmth came out to meet him the same way it had come out to meet all of them. A physical fact, a temperature impossible to argue with. He was a man who had been in Harlan County since before it was a county, and he was not a man who had often been required to stand at someone's door and understand that he had been wrong about something that mattered. Behind him, the white wall of the storm went on and on. Inside the room, 14 people were alive and fed, and warmer than they had been since October. Bram lifted his head from his paws and looked at Clem Burge, and then laid it back down again. Clem stood in the doorway for a long moment in the warmth with the cold at his back, and then he said, in a voice that carried no particular feeling except the one a man has when he has just seen something he cannot explain away, "I don't understand how it's still warm in here." He said nothing else. He came inside. His wife recovered. He sat near the hearthstone for 3 hours that first evening without speaking, and I gave him a cup of the barley broth that Ruth Hadley had made from her dried corn, and some of my salt pork, and he drank it, and then he slept on the floor with his coat for a blanket the way all the men did. And in the morning he was quieter than I had ever seen him, which was a different kind of quiet than the silence of stubbornness. It was the quiet of a man who has revised something in himself and has not yet found the right words for it. By the end of January, the storm had taken 800 head of cattle from the ranches north of Carpenter. 3 families on the creek road lost everything they had put into the ground that year. No one in my stone room on the hill died, and no one came down with a serious sickness, though the Prodder children had wet boots for a week and worried us some. Ruth Hadley sat by the fire each evening and told stories she had from her grandmother, who had come from Tennessee. and Silas listened to them with the same careful attention he had given everything that autumn, as though he was banking them the way I had banked the wood. The fire burned for 63 days in that hearth, from the night the first family came to the morning the last one left, and when the last ember went to ash in early March, the temperature inside the room was 44 degrees, warmer than any wood stove in the county had left a room when its fire went out. The storm broke on the 21st of January, and the county began to take account of what had happened. August Pell was the one who came to see me in early February, when the drifts had settled enough to travel the hill road by horse. He was a precise man with the surveyor's habit of measuring things before he wrote them down, and he spent an afternoon in the stone room with a notebook and a measuring tape, and he asked me questions about the construction that I answered from my father's notebook, which I had kept on the shelf beside the jar row all winter, its oilcloth cover spotted with hearth smoke. Pell wrote down the dimensions of the walls, the depth of the back wall burial into the hillside, the horizontal flue arrangement in the hearth, the thickness of the stone courses. He wrote down the temperatures I had recorded on my father's brass thermometer each morning of the storm, a column of numbers that ran from 48 to 53 degrees inside while the county outside was measuring -42. He looked at the thermometer column for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "This is 90 degrees of difference, Nora." I told him I knew. He wrote at the top of his notes, in careful surveyor's script, the phrase that would become the name by which the method traveled, the Grail arrangement, for my father, who had built it first in Norway before I was born, and carried it to Montana in the year that Clem Burge had first come to Harlan County and begun keeping his long account of what the land was worth and who deserved it. Pell published his account in the County Recorder's Report for 1888. And the following autumn, 3 men in the county built stone shelters using his dimensions, 2 of them men who had spent January in my room on the hill. 2 of the 3 built warm structures. The third built cold, because he copied the dimensions without understanding that the mass was the point, that the stone had to be dry laid without mortar so that the courses could breathe, that the depth into the hillside was not decoration but function, that you could not take the form without taking the principle. The 2 who understood came back to me with questions, and I answered them from the notebook. And gradually the knowledge spread the way knowledge always spreads when it is real, not by instruction but by felt understanding. The moment when a person stops copying the shape of a thing and begins to grasp the reason for it. Clem Burge came back to the hillside in the spring of 1888 and stood in front of the stone room in the April light and looked at it for a long time. He said nothing about his words the previous autumn. He said nothing about the stone folly or the root hole, or the room the size of a privy. What he said, after a silence that had some dignity in it, was that he had spoken with Pell and that he understood the principle now, and that he was going to build something on the north side of his store lot before next winter, and he wanted to know if I had any objection to his using my father's notebook as a reference. I told him the notebook was not mine to withhold. I told him the knowledge in it had been given freely and was meant to be used freely, and that if he wanted to understand it, he was welcome to sit with it as long as he needed. He sat with it for 2 afternoons at my hearthside, asking careful questions, and I answered them, and I did not say anything about the previous autumn, because there was nothing that needed to be said. He had been wrong, and the winter had told him so, and that was the only court that had ever mattered. Bram lived to 11 years, an old age for a working dog in cattle country, and he stayed on that hillside to the end of his life, lying in the dry grass in summer and in the stone room in winter, as close to the hearthstone as he could get without singing his coat. The last spring he was alive, he spent most mornings lying in the doorway of the stone room with the sunlight on his dark coat and his chin on the threshold stone, watching the lower meadow the way he had always watched everything, as though he was deciding whether it required his attention. He had seen 14 winters on that hillside by then, and most of what needed to be decided had already been decided to his satisfaction. I don't know that I have ever seen anything more at peace than that dog in the April sunlight with the stone warm under his chin and the meadow below him going green. The stone room stood for 31 years after the winter of '87. I know because August Pell came back in 1918, the year before I left Harlan County, and he measured it again, and the courses had not moved, the walls had not cracked, the hearth arrangement was sound. The hillside had grown up around it in the years since, the thin soiled grass thickening as the ground recovered from the heavy grazing years. And the room itself had settled into the hill the way my father had designed it to settle, becoming a feature of the slope rather than a structure on it, patient and present and warm every winter for 3 decades. Pell published a second account, this one in a range management journal out of Helena, and in that account he cited my father's name and the Norwegian practice that Henrik Graal had carried across the ocean in 1871. The knowledge that the earth below the frost line is always warm, that stone is an honest partner, that the margin between surviving and not surviving is always built in the preparation. I left the stone room to Silas when I left the county, and Silas kept it until the 1930s when his own children were grown and the homesteading era had finally ended and the land changed hands for the last time. But by then, the Grail arrangement, as Pell had named it, had been built in 14 counties across 3 territories, copied and adapted and sometimes misunderstood and occasionally perfected by people who had heard the story of the winter of '87 and wanted to understand how a woman with a rocky hillside and a dead man's notebook had kept 14 people warm through 9 feet of snow and 42 below. Some of them had understood it the way Clem Burge finally understood it, sitting with the principle until it became felt knowledge rather than copied form. Some of them had not. The ones who understood built warm, the ones who did not built cold. And then they came back to the notebook, and that was how it was supposed to work, which was the same way it had always worked, from my father's hands to mine, and out into a country that had needed the knowledge more than it had known. My father's brass thermometer is still there, as far as I know. I left it on the shelf beside the jar row when I left, because it belonged to the room the way the room belonged to the hill. It is possible that it is still measuring something in whatever darkness gathers in that hillside now, still telling the temperature of a space no storm has ever reached. My father would have found that correct rather than remarkable, which was his way. He did not believe in remarkable. He believed in sound. The hill does not look like much from the road. It never did. It looks like a rocky slope with some old stonework low against it, the kind of thing a traveler passes without stopping. But the warmth is still there, in the ground below the frost line, the same warmth that has always been, patient as stone, asking nothing from the season overhead.